Hello and welcome to the Investigative Journal. I'm Tal Heinrich in New York. In this program, we're going to discuss a key question that resonates in Washington, Brussels, and across the Middle East. Is the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization? The Brotherhood was founded in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, the godfather of Sunni political Islam. Its slogan in its pursuit to overthrow the British governance of the country was "Islam is the solution." As a social and political group, the Muslim Brotherhood is based on the belief that Islam is not only a religion, but rather a way of life. It claims itself to be peaceful and democratic, but terrorist masterminds such as Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi all belonged to the Brotherhood before assuming roles in their terror networks, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Not only that the Brotherhood's ideology had inspired terror, its affiliates have directly been engaged in terror activities, for instance, Hamas. Since its founding, the Muslim Brotherhood has spread to four corners of the Arab world, and even into the West, where the group has established offices in cities like London. At a time when certain Arab countries have labeled the Brotherhood a terrorist organization, Europe and the United States are considering implementing their own bans of the Brotherhood and its affiliates. This April, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, despaired by the Muslim Brotherhood, visited the White House. A couple weeks after his visit, President Trump announced that he is considering issuing an order that would designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization. To begin our conversation, we're joined by Jonathan Shanzer, Senior Vice President at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, welcome. You're joining us from Washington, D.C. John Bolton, prior to being appointed National Security Advisor to President Trump, described the Muslim Brotherhood as a front group, the smiling face of terrorism in the West. Watch.
At the Muslim Brotherhood, as you pointed out, a number of Muslim countries already describe them as terrorists. They are the front group, the smiling face of terrorism in Western Europe and the United States. There are some people who are part of the Brotherhood who are not terrorists themselves. In the communist context, Vladimir Lenin would have described them as useful idiots. They provide cover for the real terrorist activity. So if these designations happen, it's both of them very significant steps.
Jonathan, we have the top national security official in the Trump administration calling for the designation. We've seen violence certain affinity groups of the Brotherhood have committed both against their home countries and against the West. So why is the terror designation such a complicated question? Should a terrorist designation be based solely on ideology or rather on violent actions?
So you're asking the exact question that the U.S. government is going to be wrestling with. And quite frankly, you cannot designate a group because of ideology. They can have a violent ideology, but that does not qualify them to become a foreign terrorist organization designated by the State Department, nor would it necessarily qualify them for a Treasury designation for their specially designated nationals list. What you need is a track record of violence. There needs to be a very clear track record that shows that a given organization has been involved in financing terrorism, providing technical support to terrorists, engaging in terrorism themselves. And in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's hit or miss. There are lots of different factions, as you rightly noted. They're scattered all around the world. Some of them do meet criteria. You mentioned Hamas as one, but there are others in places like Egypt or perhaps Libya or Yemen that would qualify, but then many others that are very much part of the political fabric of the country where they're located, and they're not engaging in violence and they're not supporting violence through funding or other means.
Let's talk a bit about timing from a political perspective rather than just a national security one. The White House said it is looking into the matter right after President el-Sisi met with President Trump. Why now?
Well, I think a lot of this comes from the pressure that the White House is feeling from places like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, perhaps Bahrain. The Muslim Brotherhood is really despised by most of the kind of traditional kingdoms, the royal regimes that we see around the Middle East. It's that admixture of politics and religion that these countries really find very objectionable. They're a challenge to their rule, and so they have done their best to try to convince world powers to take action against the group. Again, though, I would caution that it's not an easy thing to do. And what I've seen over time engaging with a lot of these countries is they don't necessarily understand our criteria here in the United States, that we have a legal process, that we can't just designate because we don't like a group, that we have to see that evidence. And I'm not sure that that's fully understood in the countries that we're talking about here.
Really briefly, again, politically, do you think this might be the carrot that President Trump is considering giving President el-Sisi? Because the expectations he has from Egypt when it comes to the deal of the century, peace in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians, we know that Egypt is going to play or is already playing a big role.
Well, it's interesting because the U.S. has already designated two factions of the Muslim Brotherhood that are based in Egypt. One is called Hassam, the other one is called Liwa Tharwa. They are both involved in terrorist activities around Egypt, and the U.S. designated them last year. So we've actually already given that carrot to Sisi. Now, the question I think that Sisi's grappling with is whether we would be willing to do the kind of broader designation of the entire Muslim Brotherhood, which again is going to be harder, but I do think that we've already given Sisi much of what he's looking for.
Jonathan, is the Muslim Brotherhood a global threat? What do we know about their actions and goals operating in Europe or even here in the United States?
Well, see, that's interesting. That's the right question to ask because, quite frankly, they are a threat. Ideologically, they have, as you noted, inspired terrorist groups and terror leaders all around the world. Their ideology is very much a hateful one, a toxic one, and it is kind of the gateway to hard jihadism. The problem, of course, is that it is softer in the way that it has been trotted out in many of the countries where it operates, and it is that stepping stone. So it's a threat, but maybe perhaps not a threat to the level that would require designation. I think it's quite possible that the U.S. could designate it as a hate organization, for example. You could see Congress come out and be very clear about that. We could make it clear that Muslim Brotherhood members would not be welcomed in the White House or in the halls of Congress. In other words, we could start to isolate them without designating, which has a whole different criteria attached to it.
Let's focus for a second on Europe. What is happening there? What can you describe the Brotherhood's activities or their goals?
Look, absolutely, the Brotherhood is active in many places across Europe. The Europeans have been, I think, far more lax in terms of dealing with this problem. I think the U.S. is not far behind, by the way.
You're talking about what countries in Europe?
We're talking about Germany, Britain, France, Belgium. I mean, there really isn't a European country where we have not seen some element of the Brotherhood take root. And the way that it's played out is that the security services now see the Brotherhood as perhaps a window into that harder jihadi world. So they look to the Brotherhood as people who could inform them about the activities of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. I think this is fanciful thinking. I think that it is a misguided approach to the problem. What we should be trying to do again is to really minimize and mitigate the spread of the Brotherhood because it is that gateway to the harder jihadism that we see in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and beyond.
Well, behind every terror act, there is a trail of money, as we know. And last year, Jonathan, in your congressional testimony on this topic, you said, and I'm quoting, U.S. policymakers who truly wish to undermine the global reach of the Muslim Brotherhood must take a hard look at the group's state sponsors. Qatar and Turkey, often referred to as U.S. allies, are the primary state backers today of the Brotherhood. So what are you suggesting? Turkey and Qatar are two countries where the United States continues to deploy its military.
That's right. We have major bases in both countries. We have alliances with both countries. And we know that they are supporters of the Brotherhood in its bid to gain political power across the Middle East. Certainly during the Arab Spring, we saw that. But even in hot war zones today in places like Libya, you see the fingerprints of the Qataris and the Turks and the provision of funds and other assistance to these organizations. In the case of Turkey, we've seen indications of possible provisions of weapons. So these are the sorts of things that we should be trying to stop. And quite frankly, I don't see the United States taking a hard line with either country. I think it's a missed opportunity, to put it mildly. And I do think that as a result of the kind of support that both countries provide the Brotherhood, we should be reassessing our alliances. I don't think that these are good friends. If anything, we could call them frenemies, right? On the one hand, they are working with us on things that are important. On the other hand, they're undermining us in significant ways, notably through supporting the Brotherhood.
How would you describe the different approaches of the Trump administration with the previous administration of Barack Obama on this issue that you're describing?
Well, as we all know, the Obama administration basically looked to the Brotherhood as a possible solution to the Arab Spring. The Obama administration supported the Morsi administration when it came to power in Egypt, supported the Brotherhood in Tunisia, and really, I think, had a rosy view of what the Brotherhood could bring to the region. I think that the Trump administration is certainly taking a tougher stance on the Brotherhood, but I think its hands are tied, as we mentioned, because of the criteria needed for designation. It may not be able to do everything that it might want to do, and it may need to settle for half measures. One of the things that I talked about in the congressional testimony that you mentioned is that there could be ways of targeting some of the individual branches of the Brotherhood. I mentioned that there are branches in Yemen and Libya that I believe have very clear and demonstrable ties to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other violent groups. We could start by going after some of these smaller groups and branching out from there. And I believe that this is something that the Trump administration is looking at right now.
Let me ask you this. Could it be that the Muslim Brotherhood is not meeting the criteria to be defined as a terrorist organization, not because it is not involved in terror acts, but rather because it is not an organization, meaning people who claim so say they don't have a central command, they don't have units, but Hamas, which has been designated as a terror organization, is a group. It's an organization. So this is why we see the designation in this case. Your thoughts?
Right. And yeah, and I think, you raise an important point. I think we need to be doing an investigation. And I think, at least I hope, the Trump administration has ordered that investigation, that people at the Treasury Department, State Department, and within the intelligence community are going to do a deeper dive and hopefully find that there are elements of the Brotherhood that we could designate, or there are leaders within the Brotherhood that are involved in terror finance. In other words, just to say, well, we all know that that this isn't the problem, I think we don't know. I think there's a lot that we have not yet learned about how the Brotherhood moves money around the world, what kinds of groups it supports, and whether those groups are violent. So I do think that there's research to be done, and that really does come down to the bureaucracy taking this request seriously. And the hope, of course, is that the Trump administration is putting pressure on the relevant agencies.
Could it be that the designations are not such a pressing issue because the terror activities that Muslim Brotherhood are behind are more focused in Middle Eastern countries than Western countries, unlike other terror organizations?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. And I think when you look at the priorities, I mean, on the terrorism side, and the U.S. is actively looking to find designations of ISIS leaders, Al-Qaeda leaders, Hezbollah leaders, and then on top of that, we have the state sponsors of terrorism that are under what we call a max pressure campaign. So you're looking at, for example, Iran and North Korea. We've got a targeted campaign on those. So there is a question of manpower, I think. How many sanctions analysts are out there and available to look into this question, and how much of a priority, given that I think the broad assessment here in the United States is that the Brotherhood doesn't pose a direct threat, as you suggest. So it is always a question of priority within the bureaucracy, but nevertheless, I do think that the Brotherhood is a destabilizing movement in the Middle East, and if the Middle East is important to U.S. interests, this is at least worthy of looking into, and we have certainly encouraged that in the months and years past.
Jonathan Shanzer, Senior Vice President at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for joining us and breaking it down. Coming up next, we're zooming in on Egypt's historical struggle with the Muslim Brotherhood. Stay with us. The investigative journal TIJ offers exclusive long-form investigations into the leading political, environmental, and public interest issues of the day. Our first-hand investigations focus on topics ranging from human rights, counterterrorism, corruption, cybercrime, just to name a few. These bombshell reports can only be found on the investigative journal from New York. I'm Tal Heinrich. Welcome back. Islamism established itself as a powerful political force in the Middle East with the advent of the Arab Spring in 2011. There was a sense of victory when millions of protesters took to the streets and forced dictators to resign or flee. In Egypt, ousting longtime President Hosni Mubarak also came with a price. The Muslim Brotherhood dominated the political arena and ultimately came to power through the ballot box. Mohamed Morsi, a top figure in the Muslim Brotherhood, became Egypt's first freely elected president. Egyptians watched as their new Islamist president swept their dream away and issued constitutional amendments that placed him above judicial oversight. Then, all hell broke loose as millions of people flooded into the streets in protest, leading to clashes, daily casualties, and basically an Egypt marred in dictatorship all over again. Let's see how the Brotherhood reacted to the protesters who opposed them. A warning, these are graphic images. The Egyptian military responded, and the Brotherhood faced the toughest crackdown in 2013. General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took power and ousted the late Mohamed Morsi. After the coup, some Arab states followed Egypt's lead and designated the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. Among them, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. It is also defined as such by Russia and Syria. For more on this topic, I'd like to welcome Dr. Micheal Morgan, a senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Morgan.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Watching these images that we just played from Egypt, there's no doubt that the Brotherhood is in some cases complicit in acts of terrorism and, of course, motivates and inspired groups, to carry out terrorist acts. But here's another question. Will it be the right thing to do to designate the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization? Because some analysts believe that by doing so, the United States might create itself more enemies. It might further complicate relationships with Qatar and Turkey, since President Erdogan and Sheikh Al Thani are also staunch supporters of the Brotherhood. Is that a valid argument in your view?
So the answer is absolutely yes. And the reason why I have to be more elaborative about, because it's not like black and white. It's usually, I like usually to go back in history and go in a pattern. So if you allow me for 2 minutes just to go back in 1928 when Hassan al-Banna has formed this group in Egypt, it was basically, it's an Islamic movement to try to have the British out of Egypt, and it had so many hidden agenda about it. But if you look at the pattern, they always come very close to the governments, to the presidential offices. They try to manipulate their way through until they get to where they want to be, and then all of a sudden they start asking for so many things in power in those countries that they work for, and then when the governments realize the danger of this group, they try to ban them, and this is when they start to go violent. So they did that with Sadat, they did that with Nasser, they did the same thing with Nokrashi Basha in Egypt. It's a pattern. So what I'm trying to say is, why wouldn't they do that here? If they have been doing the same thing over and over, they come close, they put on the face of democracy and the political arms, but they have their violent wings. They have the violent wings, like Hamas and all these terrorist organizations. So the answer is yes. Despite the fact that I had talks with many of the diplomats and former ambassadors and a lot of people in the Capitol Hill, which they reflected what you had mentioned, that, you know, America should not create more enemies. But my question is, this rule of keep your friends close and your enemies closer doesn't apply here, because your enemy here is a ticking bomb. So if you bring that enemy closer, sometime it's going to explode in you. So you really have to boycott this enemy.
Dr. Morgan, back in June, you organized a panel on Capitol Hill on the issue of designated the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. And one lawmaker who previously tried to push for such legislation is Senator Ted Cruz. Since he could not attend the conference, the senator sent a video message. Let's play a part of it.
Sure.
The Muslim Brotherhood's motto is jihad is our way, and dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope. This is who some in the press and some in the political world urge us to think of as a moderate group. Well, read the Brotherhood's explanatory memorandum on the general strategic goal for the Brotherhood in North America. It says, quote, "The process of settlement is a civilization jihad process. The Muslim Brotherhood must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within."
Dr. Morgan, you have seen the Ikhwan's actions, the Muslim Brotherhood's actions in your own eyes. Explain, what is Senator Cruz talking about?
So Senator Ted Cruz has previously submitted the bill to the Congress about designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and he based his argument on the fact that he realized that the pattern of the Muslim Brotherhood is to try to destroy the Western civilization from within. And he didn't make that up. I didn't make that up. There was a memorandum, explanatory memorandum of the strategic goal of the Muslim Brotherhood in the North America. This was penned in 1991 by a guy called Muhammad Akram al-Dawni, and it was found by the raid of FBI in 2004 on a Virginia house, and this was submitted to the court and became public in 2007.
How can the Brotherhood claim to be democratic and peaceful, and on the other hand do exactly what you're describing?
Because that's what they do. They just tell you one thing on TV and on the press, and they just do something else and behind closed doors. So that memorandum of the strategic goal of the Muslim Brotherhood, it says explicitly the process of settlement in the civilization jihadist process with the word means the Ikhwan must understand that their work in America is a kind of a grand jihad. So this is, I'm not making this up, not Micheal Morgan. This is Muhammad al-Dawni. And this is public. This is not something I came up with. Eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within. And this is what we see now. And I want to bring to your attention, and I really don't want to, attack certain groups or organizations, but we see that the Muslim Brotherhood have used Islam as a shield and as a way to get to the other side of the Western civilization, and try to use the fact that the West allows other religions and other groups and other ethnicities to come in and prosper. But if we look, now we have Muslim community police in Brooklyn, that they have the same exact cars as NYPD. You can never tell the difference. If you look at it while it's driving or stopping, you can't even tell the difference. You really have to focus. And this is how they start. They start using the system. They find ways of trying to use the system to get to the point where they have control, and then they want to apply Sharia law and all that. That's in Brooklyn. That's not in Afghanistan. This is in Brooklyn, New York.
Apply Sharia law in the United States?
That's what their goal is, and this is what their motto: Islam is the only solution. And it's a problem, because I feel like Americans deserve to know the truth, and American people deserve to be safe. And I strongly believe that the current administration is trying to make that happen. And I'm afraid that this might be a little difficult, because the previous administration had been in bed with the Muslim Brotherhood for a long time. And I think there's
Talk about Egypt here and in the Obama administration reading of the map of the coup and everything that happened around 2013.
Well, obviously, 33 million people when they came out on the street and tried to oust Morsi, the former president of Egypt. Obama came out on TV and all over the news and said this is definitely a coup, and we don't support the Egyptian movement, which is really I find it very controversial because Americans usually support the will of the people, and this is what America has been doing all over the world, and for him to abide with his agenda to get the Muslim Brotherhood to overtake the region and possibly form the caliphate, what Turkey is dreaming of, it's a problem, and I feel that's going to be in the way.
Now, regarding the question of designation, some analysts argue that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a terrorist organization, not because it's not complicit in terror activities or inspiring them, but rather because it is not an organization. They say it doesn't have a central command, it has no units, and hence they say it doesn't have an established pattern of terror. What do you say to that?
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood has been deceivingly working inside the American community and all over the world in a very organized pattern. They actually have a hierarchy that I have wrote over here. They do have the executive office. They have the Shura Council. It's 100 people that will decide what to do, what to vote, where to go, what not to go. And those are the same people that pitched the strategy for North America. So when we say they are not organized, they are very, very organized to the core.
From the very first day in office, it seemed that President Trump was really keen on defining who is a friend in the Middle East and who is a real enemy.
Absolutely.
And of course, these definitions were really different than what the previous administration's definitions were. What do you think about the designation in these terms? Why is it so important to define the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization? I mean, does it help the U.S. counterterrorism efforts?
Absolutely.
Does it have a practical significance?
It's going to dry out the means of funding right away. So, the State Department will investigate, find out if there are any of the affiliated organization to the Muslim Brotherhood here in the U.S. using U.S. taxpayer money to fund terrorism somewhere else in the Middle East or any part of the world. That's going to be huge, because now once you cut the fund and once you dry out the sources of funding to these terrorists, so it's going to help the counterterrorism. That's number one. Number two, what's right is right. It has to be the right thing. People have to be safe. What did we gain from getting close to Osama bin Laden? We lost 2 towers. We lost 3,000 souls of American people. This is what I like to warn all the Americans all the time. A lot of times it's important to work with enemies, but that's not kind of enemy. This is a monster. We can't just keep the monster keep growing from within.
Dr. Micheal Morgan, at this point, I'd like to thank you for your insights and your time. We appreciate this.
My pleasure.
And that is all for this episode of the Investigative Journal. I'm Tal Heinrich in Times Square, New York. Thank you all for watching.